Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the 2010-2011 Budget Study Session number 1. The date is March 30th, 2010. And we have a roll call.
Council members Draymond.
Here.
Friedman.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Mayor Quintero.
Here. Mr. Starbird.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. This will be the first in what we expect to be 37 budget study sessions this year on the 2010-11 budget. No, we don't expect that many. Mr. Mayor, as we have approached this first budget study session, as you know, and others can imagine, there's been a number of meetings among the staff to prepare both for this meeting and over 2 months ago begin to prepare for the upcoming year's budget. It does feel as if we have never gotten out of the budget preparation process. It was just several weeks ago that you had the mid-year budget update for the 2009-10 budget that we're currently in. And we continue to feel the effects of the economic downturn. I know in some readings I've seen some economists are saying we are no longer in a recession. Others, I think, are doubtful. It certainly continues to feel like a recession, and we in the city continue to feel the impacts of that. So if it looks like and sounds like a duck, I guess it is a duck for all intents and purposes. I know Mr. Draymond's working up a response to that. As we evaluated the upcoming year with an anticipated shortfall in the neighborhood of $7 to $8 million, we did what we've traditionally done. We turned all the operating departments and we said, please prepare plans for reducing programs and service reductions for the upcoming year, and we did this in 2 levels, 3%, then an additional 2% for a total of 5%. And it struck us as we looked at those that with the last 2 years of reductions, we have really gotten to the point that although I think we do a very good job of masking the impact of cost reductions in the services of the public, in other words, they don't feel a great deal of impact from the cuts that we have implemented, we are to the point now that further cuts do continue to cut to the bone. And the list of each department's reductions reads position by position that would be eliminated. For example, in the police department, if we had to implement a 5% reduction, which is about $7.5 million across the general fund departments, there would be 13 sworn positions eliminated and 6 non-sworn. You recall very vividly just 9 months ago as we talked about budget reductions and actually did eliminate sworn positions and came very, very close within a couple of weeks of actually laying off 3 young police officers in our police department as a result of that budget. I know it's fresh in your minds, the discussions you had just 9 months ago, and these would be more serious. So having prepared those plans, frankly, we turned our focus on identifying approaches to balancing the upcoming year's budget that would not reduce services and program levels. And although the organization has done a great job of continuing to fill in the gaps, it seemed to me and to your staff that we really need to put an effort into finding ways to reduce the cost of services we have on the street, not reducing the services that we have on the street, because we can very little afford to continue to reduce those service levels without feeling a serious impact in our community. So in order to accomplish that, we've really focused on a set of strategies that I sort of identify as falling into 3 categories. Improving the resources in the general fund, finding ways to bring more resources in to support what we're doing, with the ultimate goal of maintaining this last year's or this current year's service levels in the upcoming year. There are no service improvements, there's no additional staff, there's nothing additional that we're trying to do. We'd feel very fortunate if we can just maintain this current year's service levels. So 1 is trying to find ways to improve the resources to the general fund. 2 is reviewing our revenue estimates again, and I've had Michelle and Bob meeting with me and actually talking about revenue by revenue, what our estimates are. Are they still good? Are they too optimistic? Are they too conservative? Can we find ways to eke out a few more dollars, because every dollar we can eke out of the estimates, as long as we're being realistic, will reduce the impact on our departments. 3rd, and very important, is finding ways to partner with the employee groups so that we can have them shoulder a greater share of our costs, actually reducing the cost of hours that we put on the street. They have done a great job the past 2 years in partnering with us and finding ways to reduce costs. in foregoing increases that were scheduled. We need to continue to do that, and we're calling on them again this year, and as you'll see in the outline, that plays a very important role among the strategies that we have for balancing the upcoming year's budget. With that, this morning will be an overview. I call it a 20,000-foot elevation overview of our budget, not digging into the details of every department. We have all of that if you'd like to get into it. But I imagine those discussions of the department cuts and service levels are still very fresh in your mind from last year. And I'm hoping that with the number of strategies we've identified, we'll be able to balance next year's budget if they're acceptable to you and avoid more serious cuts in programs and service levels. With that, let me turn to Bob Elliott, Director of Finance, to begin the overview. Bob?
Thanks, Jim. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the budget and accounting staff because they have put in a lot of extra time this year in looking at some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Michelle Flynn and Lily Fang and their staffs have really done a lot of extra work this year, and we'll talk about what those items are. What we wanted to cover today is really go back a little bit and look at the 08-09 year-end results to give us a point of reference in terms of where we were with our fund balance and our general fund. Look at our adopted budget for 9-10, what the numbers were and how we got there. And then, as Jim said, go into our 10-11 challenges and the projections, and then our recommended strategies. So first off, just a reminder, everybody's seen this slide before. It's the 2008-9 year-end results, how we ended up the year as of June 30th, 09, what our original budget estimates were, what we revised mid-year last year was quite a reduction, about $7 million. And how we ended up the year, our revenues came in about where the revised budget was. Our expenditures, mainly due to the hiring freeze and some of the other reduction strategies that we put in place, came well below our expenditure estimates or revised estimates. We had some changes to our fund balance, mainly encumbrances. We presented the council with the idea of taking that $1.6 million from the PERS prepayment and putting in setting it aside for our future PERS costs, which are coming in 11-12. And you can see where we ended up the year at $53.4 million with general fund reserves about 33%. Recall our target is 35 and our floor is 30%. Then we move into the 9-10 general fund budget. Our original estimates, when we started the process last year, we had about a $9.6 million gap. Some of the strategies that we implemented last year, we implemented a full cost allocation that netted the general fund about $2 million in additional revenue. The fleet consolidation, there was a one-time contribution back from the fleet fund to the general fund of $1 million. We used $1 million of the prior year's surplus. The key item there was all the departmental reductions, about $4.2 million, and those were some pretty hard cuts. The firefighters gave up their COLA, eliminated their COLA, was $1.2 million. We had some other organizational changes. You recall we redid employee health services and some other benefit programs, netted a reduction, and then just some other adjustments to get to our adjusted budget of $164.8 million.
Let me note there that for those 2 years then, I think a total of about 100 full-time positions in the general fund had been eliminated through the various budget reductions. So those are real positions. We talk about the freeze, which we've had in place, but those were actually eliminations of positions beyond the ongoing freeze. So in 2 years, about 100 positions in the general fund. And you'll note the angst we had last year talking about the need to actually look at reduction of fire sworn staff, police sworn staff, and all of that I know caused you a great deal of concern, but was one of the realities that we faced in trying to continue to close the gap each year.
So that moves us to the 2010-11 challenges, as we've outlined. Some of the areas that we're looking at in terms of our cost increases with our employee contracts. existing employee contracts, our medical and benefit costs. Our first estimate at the medical increases are 10 to 13%. We have some issues in our workers' compensation and liability insurance funds that we outlined during the CAFR presentation back in December. We've managed to have some deficits in there, and we're working on a 10-year plan with some additional funding to rectify those issues. And we have the increase in PERS rates coming in 11, 12, and 12, 13. And recall we've discussed in the past that PERS has implemented a temporary 3-year super smoothing where they push out some of the actuarial losses out and then re-smooth it. It saves us rates or lowers our rates for the next several years, but basically pushes that out to the future, and it gives us a rate relief now. That said, we're still going to have some significant rate increases coming up. Our challenges are to try and maintain our current service levels and not reduce those at all, but reduce the costs involved with those, and identify additional resources to support those general fund programs, however we can do that with additional revenues or partnering or other ways. So this is our initial estimates. We've been working on this for several months, going through the different estimates. As you can see, we start at the adopted 9-10 budget at the $164,800,000. We've added a little bit in property tax. Although our assessed valuation is virtually flat, there's a little bit additional revenues and some supplementals, so we're raising that a little bit. Our license and permits was basically is a reflection of the construction permits. Building industries are remain down, although we may see a little improvement in that with some projects coming online. Use of money in property, that's basically our interest earnings. We're below 2% in our $460 million portfolio, so that reflects our interest earnings. Cost allocation, we implemented the full cost allocation last year, a very complex way to roll out overhead costs from the general fund to non-general funds. There were some changes and reductions in that. This year we're making a lot of personnel changes with the collapse of community development housing and distributing all those staff. We've pulled the fleet fund out of the general fund last year, so we have those changes. And we've done a restructure of the Information Services Department, and we're pulling that out of the general fund into internal service funds. So a lot of changes in this, so there was a little bit net reduction in the cost allocation revenue. We've eliminated the transfer from the fleet fund. We did that one time last year, so we've reduced that out. And we've also taken out the use of prior year fund balance, which we had in last year. On the expenditure side, we have our increases with our salaries, with our existing contracts. We've got the increase in our PERS costs and other medical benefits. We've got an election next year, so we've added in the cost of running the election under the city clerk's budget. And then we just have a budget under expenditures. That gets us right now to $172 million in expenditures, which gives us an initial gap of $8.1 million. So taking that initial gap of $8.1 million, these are some of the strategies that we're recommending council adopt for this coming year budget. The first strategy is increasing the redevelopment agency loan repayment back to the general fund. It currently is just over $2 million. We're recommending adding $1 million to make it an even $3 million. Recall last year that we increased the interest rates on the amounts that we are charging the redevelopment on the loan. We currently put 4% of our sales tax into the CIP fund. We're recommending to put that all into the general fund, so that will leave no sales tax going into the CIP fund. And we'll have a CIP study session in the next couple weeks, or next week, to discuss the impacts of that. Commercial refuse fee transfer, idea from Steve Zern, so I'll give him full credit. That's basically $1 million coming from the refuse fund for the commercial portion of the enterprise. We've put in potential salary and benefit concessions from what we have now in our existing contracts. That's kind of a placeholder. Some of the additional building projects that are coming online, we're looking at a potential of $1 million in new permit revenues, so we've put that in as a placeholder. And then yesterday we worked through with departments and came up with $1 million, and that's really just reductions in M&O expenses, no impacts to staffing in this number. That gets us to a balanced budget with a skosh of a surplus, the official term skosh. And just as we footnoted down here, we still have a hiring freeze on top of this as kind of a backup. Currently, we have approximately 75 positions that are still frozen in the general fund, so there are salary savings from those positions. And I will tell you that is a very dynamic thing. We do have some positions that are filled, so that report is fluctuating frequently, but typically has anywhere from $4 to $6 million in savings. And then we've asked departments to prepare reductions in all their various areas at 3% level and 5% level, which will net quite a savings if we go down that road.
Well, Mr. Mayor, let me comment on some of these before we move on, because as I noted earlier, the program reductions are ones that we hope not to implement, provided that we can be successful in implementing each and every one of these strategies. And let me talk on a couple of them for just a second. The GRA loan payment increase, in talking with Phil Lanzafame, we feel we can shoulder that without a significant impairment in GRA's programs, with the boost in our interest rate on the outstanding loan. I don't know that this even pulls down the principal. Does it, Phil? No. So it really doesn't have an impact on the outstanding principal, which ends up being paid at the end of the project life after your other bonded debt is paid off. So we continue to have that resource that sits out there for future years. The CIP sales tax allocation to the CIP, you recall the discussion last year when we transferred a good portion of the sales tax and CIP back into the general fund, and the implications on our street fund. Then we noted that we had a considerable balance in our gas tax reserve and anticipated keeping our street level of maintenance and replacement at the same level we'd had in previous years. My concern throughout the year was that the state legislature would eventually turn back to our gas tax allocations, and that continued to be threatened. In this year, that doesn't seem to be as great of a threat. The legislature did pass the excise tax, sales tax shift for gasoline, but everything we hear that keeps us whole and possibly even gives us a bit of a boost, at least for this year. Now, that doesn't mean it won't be a threat in future years, but I think for this year we continue to be safe on our gas tax. We may have some additional allocation through the Measure R, which will give us some additional funds for our street program. Since most of the sales tax revenues had actually been utilized to supplement our street program, I really don't see our street program needing to suffer, at least in the upcoming year. Now, the gas tax revenues may be under threat again in the what would be the 11-12 state budget. We'll have to watch that closely. But for now, I think we can do this without impairing that. The salary and benefit concessions, this is where I mentioned in my opening comments the importance of partnering with the employee groups and looking at ways to reduce the cost of the hourly services that we're putting out on the street. There's a great deal of debate and discussion in the public currently about the cost of both health benefits as well as retirement costs, and our employee groups have been very open to looking for ways to reduce the city's portion of those costs. Here we've targeted a level that we think is doable, but again, it's going to depend on those groups working very hard and working with us to find ways to shoulder a greater share of those costs, both retirement and potentially health benefits. In the absence of this key strategy, because it's about 40% of our overall strategy, we will likely have to turn back to program reductions if we can't meet some of those targets. But I'm very optimistic, given the discussion so far, that we're going to be able to do that. The groups have been very open, very responsive, and very positive in looking for ways to assist close this budget gap. Lastly, the building permit revenues. This actually came out of a conversation just in the last few days looking at our revenues. The original estimates for the upcoming year were based on this year's level of development. We've identified several projects in the upcoming year that we're fairly confident will come to pass, and with that, we're comfortable that we can boost the building permit revenue in the upcoming year above this level to pick up an extra $1 million in the upcoming year. Some initial signs that there may be some warming in the economy, at least the development economy. But this isn't pie in the sky. This is actually based on 4 projects that we are very confident will be pulling their permits in the upcoming year. So we were comfortable adding this back to the revenue estimate for the upcoming year and closing the gap. As Bob noted, my recommendation would be that we continue the hiring freeze as a backstop to all of these strategies, and that we keep the department program reductions in the back of our minds as we move through implementation of these, so that if any of them don't work, we both have a backstop, as well as we may have to come back and have further conversations about department reductions if indeed any of these strategies aren't successful as we approach July 1. Why don't we stop there for a moment? Any questions, feedback from council at this point?
Ms. Friedman.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have just a couple questions for now. Have we looked at the new federal health bill and how that's going to impact us, if at all? I know it's all pretty new.
It is all pretty new. We were discussing it just yesterday during one of our budget meetings, and Matt Doyle and HR staff, we know, will be getting further updates as CalPELRA and other professional groups begin to dig into it. I think in the short term, we anticipate there'll be some cost increases for us to the extent that all employees are required to be covered by some level of health insurance. You have to offer some form of programming. That may include all of our hourly and part-time employees who are currently not covered. And components like the $2,000 penalty if you don't offer a program, we're not sure how that gets played out and implemented, but indeed we may be required to have some form of health coverage even for employees who are not currently covered. That will likely increase our cost in those areas. We don't know how much, we don't know what form they may take or when they are required to be implemented, so we're having to watch that very closely.
Okay, and my second question is more just my own curiosity. Does the special election that's coming up for Paul Krikorian seat for Assembly, do we have to pay for those elections?
No, it's entirely the county.
Good to know. Thank you.
Good to know. And I might note, we showed the $400,000 cost of the upcoming election in 11 on the screen. There is an offset to that. We collect back about $175,000 in revenue. So the net impact is more like 2.25 on our budget. We don't have the 175 in here, but that also helps give us a little bit of cushion on the general fund balance.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Mr. Najarian.
I have just a couple questions. Let's go to page 6 of the slide. Okay. And the property tax revenues, so you're anticipating an increase over the 9-10?
A little bit, yeah. Our assessed valuation is basically flat. It's actually went down like 0.02%, roughly. I forgot the dollar amount. Very, very minor reduction. But the trend is we're getting more in supplementals. As property turns over and the base goes up, we're seeing a little bit higher revenue in our supplementals. So we've added in a little in the supplementals, but it's relatively flat for all intents and purposes.
So is that a conservative? I mean, it looks like it's a pretty significant sum.
Although we should note this is on a base of about $40 million in total property tax revenues.
Okay, so that's a 2%.
Actually, $41 million
$41 million.
in total property tax revenues. So
It's about a 2%.
It's
increase.
Yeah, but offsetting with some of the reductions. So.
Okay.
And I would presume, Bob, it's based on this year's actuals that we
Yes.
received in our first allocation. So we get a first allocation of property tax revenues in the December timeframe, and then we get some advances in advance of the April payment, but then we get a fairly significant payment in April. So Finance Department get a pretty good sense of what we're actually going to receive in the current year based on that mid-year December allocation that we get, and this estimate is based on that. So this is where you really get a pretty clear idea of what the current year's revenues will be, and that becomes the base for the upcoming year, for estimating upcoming year. And that's what this is based on.
Okay. And then the next couple items down, the use of money and property, that reflects our investment
rate.
income? And
Which currently is about 1.97, I think, in the portfolio.
So does that indicate that our projection was off, or that the actual was off?
It's reflective of the what we're thinking the interest income will be for 10-11 based off the reduced returns for this year. As the
So they'll even be lower?
portfolio amount is fairly constant, the returns keep going down.
Let me point this out by way of explanation. You'll note that we begin with the adopted 9-10 budget for both resources and expenditures. Then everything becomes an adjustment to that for the upcoming 10-11 year. And you recall in the mid-year budget report, we came in and noted that we expected to be $3.5 million below our estimated revenues in the adopted budget. And they were in the areas of our building permits, our interest income, and I'm forgetting the third. But two of the major ones were the licenses and permits for building and the use of money and property. So this reflects our adopted 9-10 budget and our anticipation that this year we'd actually be below our estimates. And you recall we were keeping the general fund balanced with our backstop of the frozen positions, which will actually probably end up netting us a $1 or $2 million surplus in the current fiscal year. But as we start 10-11, unless we could see an increase, we start with what we think will be the actuals from this year. And that's why you see this adjustment up there.
Okay, so the big picture, the 20,000-foot picture, indicates that we will have a balanced budget without factoring in the benefits of the hiring freeze or the department program reductions.
Correct.
Just through this, and not tapping into our general fund reserve?
No. In fact, in all likelihood, you'll see 9-10, the current year, we will likely end the year with a surplus of at least $1 million, could be closer to $2 million this year. And then in the upcoming year, we don't tap that reserve. We will come back and recommend some reallocations of a number of different both reserves as well as fund balances in order to address the deficiencies in the liability fund that Bob noted. And we'll talk about that in a later session, but as it relates to the general fund's operating budget, no, we don't tap the reserve. If we're successful with these strategies, emphasis on if, and that includes continuing to work with the employee groups on the goal of finding $3 million in cost savings, or I'll call it cost shifts, then we think we can balance the upcoming year's budget without having to reduce staffing, service and program levels, or utilize reserves.
Okay, so before I let my breath out, and, because I think many of us were holding our breaths up to this point, would it not be, we have to take our general fund with our other ancillary funds as a whole. Are there any, not to get ahead of ourselves, but are there any crises waiting us in those other funds, just to make the general fund look balanced without extreme budgetary measures? It's a great job, and if this is conservative projections on both the revenue and the expenditure side, I think great, you've done a great job, but do we have any surprises lurking in some of those other funds that maybe we've shifted and not given as much attention?
I want to get to the answer. Answer is no. I feel very good about the city's overall financial picture. And I think that's reflected in feedback we had just this year from the rating agencies, as an example. You've heard a lot about the state's ratings. You've heard about LADWP and LA City's ratings. Our ratings actually went up by the rating agencies. They were improved for both our general fund, which is the outstanding bonds of COP, certificates of participation on the police building, and our rating went up on our redevelopment agency bonds, and our rating has gone up for GWP. And if you read the summary analysis by the various rating firms, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch, you'll see what they look at in evaluating the city of Glendale, and what they look at in evaluating the state and other cities. And that has to do with the city council setting policies, addressing issues, looking forward, the management of our finances, as well as sort of the conservative approach that you take and Glendale has taken for a long time in balancing the budget. Do we have any weaknesses in the overall fiscal picture? I think the only area that we need to give particular attention to is what Bob mentioned. There are several of our internal service funds that, as a result of, for example, the storms in 2005 and the payouts that we had to make as a result of the damages to private property in those storms and litigation, the liability fund needs to be shored up. We need to find a way to put more resources into that fund. Workers' compensation has seen large increases in cost in the past several years. Our employee health fund, as you all know, the rising cost of health coverage has hit that fund as well. And we need to come back and talk about how we can shore up those funds and get them in a much better condition than they're currently in. Bob has a multi-year plan to do that, and I think we can find resources to put into those funds while maintaining the general fund's current condition and address that issue. But other than that, I see no areas of the city's financial picture where we need to be ashamed or concerned about our current condition. In fact, I think we can be very proud of it.
Thank you. Okay. Raymond.
Just two quick questions, or a question and a comment. Quick question has to do, you mentioned PERS and the smoothing and so on. Do we have, will we be talking about eventually our long-term strategy in terms of PERS? Because
let me touch on that if I can. We meet every year with a gentleman named John Bartels, who is probably the preeminent actuary on the West Coast in these systems, and he's been a very busy man, as you can imagine. And when you see, and I spent some time looking at a number of articles and reports that are addressing the issue of the impact over the next several years of retirement programs for cities, counties, special districts, school districts, but in particular the state. And you'll hear two components of that, and it kind of all gets rolled into this topic of retirement costs. One is retiree health benefits. The other is retirement payments under the normal retirement programs. Both of those present tremendous challenges for many agencies. In Glendale, as I've noted, we do not provide lifetime retirement benefits for retirees. We never have, and we currently do not. The only level of benefit we provide is we allow them to remain in the group, and the retiree pays both the employers and the employees' costs. The city doesn't directly subsidize those costs. As a result, we don't face the unfunded liability issues that the state does, that school districts do, that LA County does, that LAUSD does for those retirement costs. And there are a number of articles out there talking about this big bomb that sits out there at the state level. That's because the state does provide retiree health benefits. They provide it to school district employees through STRS, which is one of the reasons why STRS is facing so much pressure today, in addition to their losses in the market and the implications of that for their retiree benefits and costs. They also have this big issue out there about retiree medical costs. So Glendale is different in that regard. But as it relates to our basic retirement costs, yes, we're anticipating that we will have increases in the future, beginning in the 11-12 year is the estimate. And a lot of that will depend on PERS's investment activity in the next several years. Mr. Bartels showed us that and he actually used an example, 3 different levels of return by PERS. If PERS falls short of its 7.5% assumed return, if PERS hits their assumed 7.5% return, and then if PERS goes beyond that and is more successful. And to date, PERS has been beating its 7.5% assumption. And there's been a lot of talk just recently about whether or not PERS should ratchet down its assumption for returns, and the conclusion has been no, that based on what PERS has done, their 7.5% assumption on return on the portfolio continues to be a realistic estimate of what their performance will be. If they hit their 7.5% return, then we potentially face in 11-12 and 12-13 1 to 3% increases in our retirement rate. Bob, if I recall?
11, 12. Yes, I happen to have them right here. I have that chart, too. The rates for next year, which we already have, our safety is 25, which is a slight increase. Miscellaneous is 11.6, which is almost flat. 11-12, we see the first a little bit of increase in the super smoothing. Safety goes up to 27. Miscellaneous goes up to 13.6. And then 12-13, they continue to rise at fairly steep rates.
Now, again, that'll depend on PERS' actual return on the investment portfolio. But as a long-term hedge against that, we're recommending we do two things. One is we continue to set funds aside through our prepayment of our PERS, our prepayment to PERS of our employer's portion of retirement. When Mr. Elliott came here almost 2 years ago now, he recommended that we participate in a program that PERS has where you can prepay your annual premium. And they will essentially credit you with almost their full investment assumption. We can't make that kind of money on our own by our own investments. So we have, for 2 years now and will for a third year, prepay our employer's portion of our PERS contribution to PERS at the beginning of the year. Then they essentially give you a considerable discount on that prepayment. That is what's generated our $1.6 million savings this year, about $800,000 the first year we did it. And our recommendation has been we take that money and set it aside in a special reserve to do our own smoothing of future PERS rates. And we will continue to do that until we start to see these rate increases. That will give us an additional hedge against those cost increases. Secondly, and I think probably most important, is my recommendation to you and conversations we've already begun to have with the employee groups. I think we need to look at creating a second-tier retirement program for new employees who come on board. And probably the earliest we could implement that would be January 1 of 2011, the upcoming calendar year, because you have to go through a PERS contract amendment. And that we look at lesser-level programs for all new employees coming in. For example, 2% at 55 or 2% at 60, which are still programs being offered by PERS for non-safety, and programs like 3% at 55 or 2% at 50, which you've seen some communities go to on the sworn and safety side. Doing that won't result in immediate savings, but over time, as people retire, it will begin to bring down the cost of the cost of retirement for our employees. And that's something I believe we should begin to do. We should look at implementing it. We've had conversations with employee groups. They're open to the concept. They haven't rejected it. And so far, we've continued to walk down that road. So long term, two components. One is setting money aside to begin to do our own smoothing of rates so that when the cost occurs in 11, 12, and 12, 13, we can bring funds back in to reduce the impact on the general fund. And then two, talk to our employee groups and begin to move down the road toward creating what's called a two-tier system here in Glendale.
Mr. Draymond, before you make your comment, I wanted to ask a question. Can you give us more details on the super smoothing? I mean, is there a base year that they use, or is it a
giant trowel?
a continuing?
What PERS did is they several years ago they implemented a smoothing plan. When they incurred the loss, and remember there's always a 2-year lag in how they do their actuarial costing of what the rates end up.
Can I interrupt for a second? Just by way of background, I think it's important to note that PERS has always had a bit of a smoothing process for setting rates. They've always taken a number of years and looked at your actual experience and their actual earnings in order to establish the upcoming year's rates. So even before the downturn, there was, I forget how many years it was, 3 years or 5 years.
I think it was 2003 when they implemented the smoothing.
They've always had a number of years they look at in order to adjust rates, so you don't have a lot of variations. It was in the downturn that they began to say, okay, we got to extend that because of the potential impact it's going to have on cities.
And in a sense, what they do, as Jim said, they implemented what they call the 3-year temporary super smoothing. So they're taking their investment losses and pushing them out a little bit to give rate relief to cities at this point. The net effect is, and I was listening to the PERS Deputy Chief Actuary at a conference last month, and they show the line, and in a sense we get rate relief now, and we have a slight increase over what would have been the increase had they not done the super smoothing. So it helps us now. We do pay a little bit more later on, But as with all things, with the returns, their assumptions, there's probably 30 or 40 variables that go into the actuarial modeling that they use. So any one of those things could upset the apple cart in terms of how those rates come back to the city. Bear in mind, too, that it depends on our employee population. As our hiring freeze has been implemented, some of the assumption that PERS uses that we have a normal employee growth, we have embedded cost increases. As they take into effect those things as years move on, our rate should decline a little bit since we haven't really had any hiring. We haven't had any COLAs for the last several years. Those things all impact the rates in which PERS comes back with for the cities.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think we also have to remember, I mean, the drop, both real estate and the stock market, took place in '07, '08, by '09, now into 10. That, except for real estate, the stock market has changed. It absolutely has started on another climb. So it's not that, for sure 1 year from now that we're going to be in another recession. I mean, so I think we have to be a little bit optimistic, not just project that this downturn is going to continue. It's not reflected in the stock market at all. The real estate market is a different story.
Right. Let me come back, Mr. Mayor. Some more information on PERS. A lot is noted in the media and comments you've had at council meetings about the percentages that we're currently contributing for retirement for our employees. One of the problems we have is that during the years from 1999, actually 1998, through 2003, 2004, public agencies and PERS were benefiting from what was called superfunding. PERS was doing so well in its return that communities were superfunded, which meant that the employer rate continued to drop over the years to the point that at one point Glendale for several years made no contributions into the retirement plan. Employees did in Glendale, but the city didn't. We were zero rate for several years and a very nominal small rate for 2 or 3 years beyond that. I'll point out, in 1985, long before when we saw these enhanced retirement programs, Glendale's retirement rate for the employer was 20% miscellaneous and 35% safety, and actually trailed along in that fashion in the 30% to 20% range for safety for many years. And it was in the beginning of the mid-'90s where the rate began to drop because PERS was doing so well with its investments. But we went along for years and years where the safety rate was in the 20, 21, 22% range, and for miscellaneous in the anywhere from 8.5% to 12.5% range. So we went through a period of time, almost 6 or 7 years, where we benefited tremendously by not having to make that contribution into PERS. And then coming out of that now with the losses in the stock market and having to come back to realistic rates on what we should have been contributing for those programs is what's been difficult for us and other public agencies to have to contend with. Had we been smart and farsighted enough back in those early days, we should have continued to make our contributions into a fund that would have offset the increases that came later on. But cities didn't, because we were also in an economic downturn in the 80s and in the early 90s, where we were just trying to keep our heads above water. And Glendale, like other communities, as their PERS rates went down, they were also losing resources and having to shift that relief to maintaining basic programs. The same happened here. The same happened in communities across the state of California.
The only other thing I wanted to touch on that hasn't been raised already relates, I guess, next Tuesday, our study session deals with the capital improvement program. And on page 4, the first slide, Mr. Elliott, you mentioned in your report the reallocation, I guess, of sales tax, 4%, that normally would go to the capital improvement program, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The tune of about a little over $1 million.
Correct.
And you mentioned you will get to that on Tuesday. So not to cause you to flip the mystery novel to the end, but can you touch on it just a tiny bit today?
Well, as you recall, I guess many years ago, the CIP had a significant amount of sales tax put into it to fund the various projects. Through that, it was reduced successively, I guess, through the years. The year before last, it was at 14%. We reduced it down to 4%. And it's our recommendation that we pull that 4% out for operations in the general fund. Yes, that does leave a big hole in CIP. There is still the rubbish fees that go in there, which will be the only dedicated funding source, and we'll look at how that balances. We do have funding from the recent redevelopment bond issue for the next several years, excuse me, to fund those projects that were earmarked in that bond issue. Absent that, yes, as we have said, the CIP is a mere shadow of its former self, and it will need additional funding in the future, that's for sure.
This is really an out years issue for the CIP. It doesn't affect existing projects that you identified last year, but in the out years reduces, well, over 10 years, $10 million that otherwise would be accumulating in the CIP. Let me also note...
excuse me, Mr.
Pardon me.
So that's okay. So just to be clear, ultimately when we get to this, what we see is there is no alternative source that you have identified. It is simply the end result is more than just a reallocation. It is a whole. But okay, all right. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Mr. Mayor, if I can, something that we didn't spend very much time on, but I know the operating departments will find very important, and that is among the strategies on slide 7, you see at the bottom $1,067,000 that we're still turning to the operating departments to make cost reductions. And there we're looking at reductions that will not impact existing staffing, although there may be some positions that have been held vacant that will be offered up by a department here or there. We wouldn't anticipate this to result in any layoffs, although it may result in a position or two in some of the departments, although not safety. I think this number gets reduced by the $175,000 revenue return, so we're really down to about $900,000. We're still turning the departments for department reductions. And for some, it's very difficult to come up with an additional $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 in reductions. For some departments, like police and fire, this is a couple of $100,000 per department. And it still means that they'll be cutting into their operating resources to find ways to continue to economize. So I didn't want to gloss over that one and imply that there isn't going to be any impact on the operating departments, because we still need that $1 million to be found among economies in the various operating departments in the general fund.
Mr. Draymond.
My comment is this, Mr. Mayor. It relates to the CIP, and I suppose I could wait till next week. Let me just say, and I'm happy that my colleagues have joined me in asking that this issue be brought back as a report to the council. But it is all the more reason why I believe the issue of creating or reallocating or changing our program so that these funds, this 1% of projects that is currently going into public art in a very general sense, which could be anything from an iron teacup on the corner to who knows what, and putting that in an public art fund that can begin to offset some of the costs that are being borne by a variety of our budgets, including the general budget. But particularly so, we look at the capital improvement program that is going to go begging. And these funds could be used for issues like areas like Brandt Library, like the Civic Auditorium, like the Alex Theater, which continues to be a deficit to this city economically, that is, and civic galleries and other programs in the city, so that we don't have with the sort of elimination, if you will, of funding to the capital improvement program, a complete halt to basically public improvements, tangible public improvements for the citizens of Glendale. And this is a way to do that. I mean, the funding source exists now. It's where we place those funds. and on a large-size project, you can be talking about millions of dollars just with sizable projects. So, I urge the staff and my colleagues to continue to look at that as a viable way to go for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I'll go to the public. I have one card. Herbert Milano.
Mr. Mayor, if I might, one last thing we wanted
sure.
to touch on was the schedule for the study sessions. We just wanted to get that out there so everybody sees.
And we can come back and touch on this after your public comments.
Okay, we'll start with Herbert Milano. Mr. Milano, at your last public presentation, there was a malfunctioning time, so you were you lost 15 seconds in public comments. So I'm going to give you a minute, an extra minute. So you've added 45. Can you give him 4?
I appreciate that. They don't cuts. I disagree with that. We feel it as many of the as we drive down. So elderly fall and break their hips. We feel it on the high rates of electricity. I pay 22 cents on average for my per kilowatt hour on my building. We feel it on the increasing trash disposal fees. We feel it on the reduced police services to schools. We feel it on the reduced hours to city libraries, and I could go on. Lack of additional support for after-school programs, all of these things. It is my belief that the only solution to this budget gap, the major one, has to be addressed with the issue of payroll, meaning payroll expenditures and benefits. I have a PowerPoint that I'd like to present. I hope you have it available. I only have about 4 slides, if you don't mind. Mr. Elliott. Right there. Okay, and this is a report that I prepared a little bit earlier, and I have not updated. The notice is up to 2008. But you can see the total wages and deferred wages for Glendale going up from $100 million in 2000 to nearly $150 million, up to 2008. Easily a 50% increase in the overall salaries and wages. Can we go to the next one, please? Payroll versus inflation. If you were to take the inflation rate, it would be 24% from 2000 to 2008. We take the population rate at 3.5%, and you combine the two, and you can say that overall payroll should have gone up by only 25%, all things being equal. But yet, payroll expense went up by 50%. But you're going to see where that 50% is really coming from. Pension expense increase, what the city pays out, has gone up 300%, and that's not even extending it to the next 5 years, which you should know. And then medical insurance expenditures are by 500%. There's something wrong with that incredible increase. Next slide, please. No, the other way. There we go. The number of mid-management employees according to your workforce demographic. Employed in 1999, 167. Employed in 2008, 233. Nearly a 40% increase. Next slide, please. Public safety expenditures in 2001, $54 million. And now 111 million. That's a significant increase, 105%. Did I have another slide besides this one? No. All right. So if you're not addressing primarily the increases in the number of middle management, the increase is what has occurred with regard to the payroll expenditures for police and fire, the overall safety. And then the issue with regard to the pensions. We won't be able to really address the issue on a permanent basis. And I suggest that you have one session totally dedicated just to those particular factors, because everything else, trying to reduce libraries, they've already been reduced. Trying to reduce parks and recreation, trying to reduce everything else. The problem is there. The problem is out of those decisions that occurred in 2001 and 2005, changing the pension system so that now employees can live for the rest of their lives on retirement with 90% of the last year's income. That has to change. It's atrocious. It's incredible. We feel it. The quality of life of the residents and what we as stakeholders pay is increasing in a way that is unsustainable. That must be addressed. It must be addressed in full. Forget of everything else. If you address that issue, you solve it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Mike Mohill.
Morning, Council members, Mayor. Mike Mohill, long-term resident of Glendale. I'd like to thank Mr. Najarian, Mrs. Freeman, Quintero, Draymond, Mr. Weaver, not yet, for asking questions about the budget. I remember back in 2008, there was only one councilman here who questioned the budget. He's not here today. And at that time, questioned the budget. A month or two later, the city employees got an $8 million pay raise. And a few months after that, we had to cut the budget by about $10 million. We'll be doing that again this year. Now, not to repeat the comments by Mr. Milano, I'd like to read from Vanguard this week the pension payouts for the following city employees as of 2009. Christopher Gray, annual payout for pension is $180,000. Russell Silverling, pension payout is $156,000 annually. William Hall, pension payout is $147,000 a year. Donald Briggs, pension payout, $147,000 a year. Michael Haney, pension payout, $147,000 a year. Mark Distel, pension payout, $141,000 a year. Mr. James Ress, a former city manager, $137,000. William Bailey, $135,000 a year. And the list goes on and on. This is only 38 employees. Gentlemen and lady, how does it feel to know that these people will retire with more money than you'll ever make yourself, probably, as salaries, as either city employees, county, if you move up the ladder to the state? It's a great gig to be a city employee in the city of Glendale. Now, finally, we talked about a two-tier system for the pension. That's great. Kind of late thinking about it. But what's wrong with Social Security for the city employees? I'm on Social Security. The average city employee makes $150,000 a year. Where does that number come from? Simple. The average city employee makes $100,000. Another $25,000 paid into the pension fund by you generous people. Another $25,000 for medical benefits and dental, etc. It comes to $150,000 a year. The average city resident only makes one-third of that. I'm on Social Security, and I'm part of that one-third. How does it make you feel to know that you are in charge of my money, and you can't go back to the city employees and tell them, darn it, the game is up. Everybody's going to be on Social Security from today on. Second tier, I don't care if they have a third tier. As long as we have unions that contribute to the campaign funds of all 5 city employees right now, you tend to be beholding more to the city employees than the stakeholders here. We elected you.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Thank
Mohill.
you.
Okay, are there any other comments? Mr. Weaver?
I haven't said anything because Mr. Mohill's wondering why. Because this was a general overview, the general fund. We're going to go into the capital improvement. Department presentations. We'll be touching housing, GRA, all in the future. So I'm reserving for comments until the time we get to the specifics, not in the general overview portion. That's the way I've always done it. But what Mr. Mohill and Mr. Milano have told us, infinitum. We've heard these comments over and over and over. And as Mr. Milano has stated in the rag that he writes for, he has to get up here and repeat the same thing over and over and over, not for us, but so the public can catch on to what's really happening down here. Because we've heard it too many times. And it's very easy for Mr. Milano to get up and talk gross numbers, percentages, throw them out there. Mr. Starbird, in the last 7-8 years, didn't we hire an additional 25 police officers and support staff, bring up to about 38, 39?
That's correct.
Now, that was a little increase. That explains some of the large percentage. But don't bother getting into why it happened. Just quote a big number at the end and say, my God, the city's really out of whack. And it's things like that that bother me, repeating the same things over and over, preaching to the choir, hoping the public will descend upon us. And I, for one, council member, I don't get any emails at all based on what they say. Not a one. I don't read it in the paper, except where they write in the paper. So I think Mr. Starbird, staff have done a great job for this city. Look at the other cities around. Mr. Milano ought to go down to City Hall in Los Angeles, the city he lives in, and tell that council to get their act together. In water and power and every other doggone branch of government they have. Tell them to go over and look at Burbank, look at Pasadena. We're the envy of those cities. So all of us ought to be proud. And it's not the council that's doing it. It's the staff, Mr. Starbird, that brings it up. Yes, we can manipulate and change things. But for the most part, it's what staff puts together that we eventually react to. And this time, we're going to look real good out there in the public's eye compared to other cities when we get done. Yes, we will go through a lot of specifics in the coming weeks. But we'll end up with something very similar to what we've been presented here today. At least that's my opinion speaking for myself. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Any other comments, Mr.
I do.
Najarian?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My comments are directed at Mr. Milano, and I certainly recognize and appreciate his right to come before us and express his opinions. However, I do have a problem with him preparing a PowerPoint and flashing it before those in attendance, the council, and the rest of the city without us having a chance to look at it and develop some sort of appropriate response to it. There were a lot of numbers up there, a lot of graphs, a lot of allegations that were based on his compilation of those numbers. I don't know if they're factual numbers. I don't know if they're extrapolated or exaggerated. But I certainly would like staff, Mr. Starbird, as well as Mr. Elliott, to have a chance to respond and put those numbers, either challenge the facts that those numbers are based on, or to put them in proper context. And his opinion that we pay too much for salaries and benefits, that's, I think that can stand alone. But backing it up with a PowerPoint in such manner, I certainly would appreciate the opportunity to have cogent remarks in response from our staff here. And we unfortunately do not have that today, and it may come out next week or at another hearing, but I think the impact of our response is lost due to the delay of a week or several weeks. So, Mr. Milano, if you're out there, please try and get that to us earlier so we can have a discussion and certainly address the context and the accuracy of those numbers. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Draymond.
To add on to what my colleague, Mr. Najarian, was just stating, when we do that, the other thing I'd like to see included in a response is the nexus. The nexus. We look at axes on a graph, and we are told that this is what that there is a nexus. And my experience just since 2007 tells me there is often a nexus. Well, it's sort of, we call disjunctive algebra, Mr. Elliott. Something goes something like this. Human beings have feet, raccoons have feet, therefore raccoons are human. There's all kinds of nexes that can be made. The question is, do they apply and are they real? So we hear a lot on these graphs about population growth as it relates to city employees, and and there's an assumption that there's a nexus. I'm not sure that there is, other than on this graph. So the nexus is something I'd like to hear about as well.
Mr. Starbird.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Draymond has given me a perfect opportunity because we in the same way, I guess, Mr. Milano would say he gets to react to our charts sort of after the fact. We do follow up on his comments. We take them very seriously. Many of them strike us as that doesn't sound right, so we check the numbers out. Let me just play back to you our response to comments he made to you at the last City Council meeting, where he was also rolling through a number of budget numbers. And last week, and we've heard on several occasions where Mr. Milano uses the nexus of population, which I will tell you is not a realistic indicator of growth of costs in a community. And let me use this analogy. For about 23 years, my family size was 4. Didn't increase at all over that 23 years. It's gotten smaller since my 2 sons moved out of the house, but it certainly didn't grow during that 23 years. And yet my costs went up. Population isn't an indicator. It can be, can contribute to rising costs, but it certainly isn't an indicator. And yet it makes great headlines. It grabs the attention of residents who really aren't focusing on the details, because population in Glendale has been relatively stable for years and years. We are an urban, built-out community, and except in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, when we experienced tremendous growth, which still today is having an impact on our services, our population is very stable. And yet costs do continue to go up. Everybody who has a household knows that. But let me play back some numbers for you. Fire calls, for example, in 10 years have gone from 13,700 calls a year to 15,500 calls a year. Yet our population's only gone up 5%. We're seeing calls rise. We're seeing differentiation in calls go up. Police calls are always increasing. Numbers of citations increase. Calls for services increase. Mr. Weaver, you mentioned in 2 different budget years, we took a bold step of increasing our police staffing by 38 positions. 38 sworn positions, more if you include non-sworn. Because the population increases of the 70s and 80s in Glendale weren't matched with increases in resources and staffing. As a result, then, as it is today, Glendale has a very low proportion of sworn officers to 1,000 population. Take any other urban city and compare it. I'll put us up against anybody. And then compare our safety rates, and I'll put it up against anybody. From those standpoints, we do very well. The police budget in 10 years has increased 71%, down 3% this year from last year. The fire budget has increased 83% over 10 years, down 4% this year from last year. Those are real numbers, backed up by our budgets in each of those years. And frankly, there were changes in program and staffing throughout that 10-year period. Paramedic program, the police augmentation fund, additional staffing to respond to needs, even though our population only grew 5%. Population isn't an indicator. I was frankly a little pleased to see Mr. Milano get onto the denominator of CPI, because at least that has a little bit more relevance to why costs may increase. But that certainly isn't applicable to things like health costs. Everybody understands that the cost in the healthcare industry are on the rise. Individual policies under Anthem Blue Cross were recently increased 39%. So our population may not rise, but our costs continue to go up. I think we work very hard at containing costs. We've seen programs in the last 2 years where we have consolidated, we have eliminated, we have privatized. You've seen the employee groups contribute to helping to maintain those costs by foregoing increases that we had agreed and they had contracted for. They've foregone those increases in an effort to reduce the budget. Compare our salaries with other communities, and you won't find us standing out above the average in very many areas, and in most areas we're actually below the average because we haven't had pay increases, except in the police department for the contract last year, for the last 2 years in any of the areas. I don't think we have anything to be ashamed of. I think, Mr. Draymond, you're right. If you're going to do these comparisons and analyses, let's choose the right bases from which to compare, rather than trying to paint a picture for the public that distorts and emotionalizes the issue, and frankly isn't fair to city councils, both you and those that have gone before, who have tried to do the best thing for the community. With that, we will continue to take his information. Mr. Mohill's comment about the average public employee in Glendale makes $150,000 a year. I want to see the numbers that back that up. I will tell you, we know that the average retiree benefit in safety is $39,000 a year. Yes, with salary inflations and the increases of benefits, you've seen that rise over the past 5 or 6 years. The average retired safety employee from Glendale gets as a retirement benefit $39,000 a year. Non-safety is about $34,000 a year.
Yeah,
So
let's see the numbers.
do we need to address the future escalating costs of retirement and health care? Absolutely. But those people who worked for decades under those programs that provided them with the benefit that they also contributed to villainize them at this point and make them seem like somebody evil, I just don't think that's fair. I don't think that's reasonable. But we will continue to respond. We'll continue to take their information. I think, though, we need to all work very hard at casting these in a balanced and responsible light, as opposed to trying to emotionalize and villainize people who work in the public service, which seems to be fair game anymore today.
Okay, I'd like to make a couple of points. To the retirement point, someone who worked under the PERS system all of their adult life will not be receiving Social Security. I think sometimes the public is unaware of that, but that average of $40,000 or whatever, $34,000 a year, in fact, they won't be receiving Social Security. Then the second point I'd like to make is I'd like everyone in attendance or anyone watching at home, I'd like them to take a ride up Verdugo, up La Cañada, Glen Oaks, Brand, Central, etc. And then I'd like them to drive to Hollywood, drive through either Los Feliz, Barnum Boulevard, anyone you want, drive through Hollywood, go up through the canyons into the San Fernando Valley, and then drive on to Tujunga, where Mr. Milano lives. And then I want you to compare your seat of the pants comparison, compare the roads in the city of Glendale to the roads in the city of Los Angeles, where Mr. Milano lives. And by the way, I take those roads on a regular basis, so I know exactly what I'm talking about. And incidentally, that's true of the rest of Los Angeles, not just the neighborhoods that I mentioned. So I think our infrastructure is in extremely good shape, as well as our parks and all of the other services that the city of Glendale provides. And I'm told that constantly by people that visit here or friends, family that come into that city. Mr. Sarber?
Mr. Mayor, pardon me, I apologize for this, but there's something I forgot to mention. And on this point, I'll agree with Mr. Milano. My comments about maintaining public services and the impact of this budget were overly broad and optimistic. The cuts over the past 2 years has had a significant impact on our ability to continue to provide services. What I meant to say was that the staff, employees at all levels of the organization and all departments have worked very hard and continue to find ways to maintain services so we minimize the impact of these cuts out in the field. To say it's had no impact is overly broad. It has had an impact. Services, programs, we've had to economize, but what I'm proud of is the way the employees in every department continue to work very hard to find ways to minimize the impact to our residents out there in the community. It's just something we do. It's something we've always done. We couldn't bring ourselves to do it any other way, and they continue to work very hard. Has it had an impact? No question. We've lost programs. We've had to reduce hours. We've had to cut back on materials and supplies. And in time, you do see it out there in the community. It has an impact. I think we do a very good job, though, of trying to moderate it and minimize the actual impact out there. Lastly, comments were made last week about Glendale being like the state of California and like the city of L.A., that we are reading newspaper articles every day now about their meltdown. I will tell you that although we face the same kinds of problems as a result of the recession, pressures on our rates, pressures on our cost, the need to address these cost issues, we are not the city of L.A., we are not the state of California. You and councils before you and staff before me have never managed in the way those two organizations have managed. As a result, we are not in the same condition that the city of L.A. and the state of California are in. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. I have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We are adjourned.